I was heading down to Virginia to be with Cecil Womack and Linda Womack. It was going to be a long trip because it's a short hop to Virginia by plane. But once I got there, I was picked up in a Jeep and driven 5 hours into the countryside. And Cecil and Linda were building themselves what looked like an aircraft hangar in the middle of a farm. It was a big building they were building as their home. It had no electricity. It had no heat. It probably had no insulation. It was a big empty frame. And it was spring, which was March 10th, and it was still very cold. It was one of those days that deceives you into thinking it's warm, so all your visual senses are getting these cues about warmth, but in reality, it's chilling you to the bone. So we sat there for 5 hours, and I did my interview with them. And it was an amazing interview. These are people who came out of the coal country of Virginia. I didn't know there were black coal miners. I'd never heard of that kind of thing. I didn't know that a lot of them spent their weekends making gospel music. I didn't know that the best of them would go out on the road on the weekends on a bus and tour all over the place doing their gospel music. This is the background that Sam Cooke came out of, and this is the background that the Womack family came out of. It was an amazing revelation, an amazing story. So when I got back after another 5-hour drive to the airport, when I got on the plane that night, I took up my TRS 101 and I organized the story, because people give you story in patches and pieces. And if you put them together on a timeline, all of a sudden it's an amazing story. So I put together the story on the laptop. And then when I got off the plane, when I got back home, I realized I'd left my laptop on the plane, which wasn't exactly normal for me. And the next day, I felt like I had a cold. The next day was Saturday. Well, Saturdays and Sundays are my hardest working days of the week, and because there are no phone calls and you can concentrate on what you're doing. And but I felt down, and when I have an illness coming on, my technique is work your guts off and do what you usually do in terms of exercise, which meant a minimum of 2.5 to 3 miles of walking. So I did my 2.5 to 3 miles of walking in the whole thing on Saturday and on Sunday. And then got into the office on Monday, and things were workable despite the cold. And then something happened Tuesday that I can't even remember, because something happened to me at my desk. My staff realized there was something terribly wrong. I was very, very sick. And my staff had to stand under my armpits. You see this in movies, but you don't really see it in real life, where people are holding somebody up like that. They had to stand under my armpits and carry me basically to the elevator, get me down the elevator, and throw me in a cab. And for the next 3 months, I lay in this room on this bed, staring up at the ceiling. Most of that time so weak, I could not think. You know the scene in 2001: A Space Odyssey where they're unplugging HAL? And HAL, the computer, when they're unplugging the first circuit boards, is still swift and articulate and persuasive and charming when he needs to be. But as they get further and further toward the middle of the circuit boards, Hal's speech begins to slow down. And then when they reach the final circuit board, Hal sings the first song he ever learned, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Well, I felt like all the circuit boards had been pulled out of my mind. I could stare at the ceiling in utter calm and contentment, because there was no energy in there to do anything. And at first I thought it was a virus, and I got better. We always get better, right? I mean, it's a real shock to be sick with something for 3 days, much less 3 months. But still, you get better. That's the way life is. And I got better. And I went back to work, and I got Cyndi Lauper as a client, who's just phenomenally talented and had a new movie coming out that was phenomenal, amazing, fantastic. It's one of the most underrated movies of the last 30 years. And one day I walked 7 miles. I was in heaven. I mean, walking to Atlantic Records and walking to CBS and all the other places where I did my business. And then I went out to the Meadowlands to watch the Scorpions. They were opening for Metallica. Well, it's whatever that thing is called over in New Jersey, the Meadowlands. It's the Meadowlands, and you've got 55,000 kids, and they're all standing. So if you want to see this show, you got to stand too. So I stood outdoors for 2 hours watching the Scorpions, then headed back into Manhattan. John Mellencamp was opening at Madison Square Garden, and I stood in the wings watching, well, I don't really stand in the wings, but I stood watching John Mellencamp. And then Cyndi Lauper was graduating from high school. She'd never graduated from high school before. And I was in Queens, so watching Cyndi Lauper graduate from high school. And that's when the real trouble began.